with a Tori. Last week we got our first thumbs down on the YouTubes.
Oh, other someone does not like
I think we're talking to
that
the right
angle
people
of
now.
Genesis.
We're talking to the right people now.
Yeah, or someone missed the like button. And
That has happened before.
No,
I know
let's not like
on
ourselves. Someone
Facebook,
didn't like it.
someone
Let's
didn't
just
like it.
accept that.
It's okay, but
It's
last
okay.
week's video went like 4 or 5 times the distance in any of the other videos. So anyway,
So, that's good.
that's all
We'll
good.
take it.
All good. We're busy with a series on Genesis, specifically having a look at Genesis through ancient eyes. Last week we dealt with Adam and Eve. The week before that we dealt with Genesis 1. Troy says I waffle too much in the recap, so I'm not going to recap too much today. If you're watching for the first time, I'll just say this: please go back and watch the earlier session. This is session 4 already, and we're dealing with Genesis 4, 5, 6 to 9. So we're going to try and cover quite a bit of work today. And today we're going to be majoring on the worst Sunday school story of all time, Noah and the Ark. But before that, we just need to do a small intro. We need to cover the life of Cain a little bit, and we need to cover the distance between Adam and Eve, and we get to the time of Noah. So it's only about 1,500 years, and we're going to be doing it in about 2.5 minutes.
Okay.
So we'll see if we can do that. So Adam and Eve has Cain, and the moment Cain appears on the scene, it's right. It starts with them bringing these offerings in Genesis 5. Abel brings the first of his sheep, his livestock. Cain just brings of the fruit of the field. And God's upset with Cain because he brings of the fruit of the field. Now, to be fair, Cain seems to be a fruit farmer, and Abel seems to be someone that's herding livestock around. So why would God be so upset with this? Well, if we read a little bit later on in the Torah, we realize that Abel was bringing a first fruit. He was bringing of the first of his livestock, and Cain was just bringing some fruit. The idea of first fruit really also only develops much later in the timeline. And so what we have there is we have kind of like an anachronistic type of writing, and it's one of the ways in which we realize that this is actually written much later than the time it's actually set in. So just to give a quick idea of what the idea of an anachronism is it's if we found a book tomorrow, discover it in the yard, and we open it up, and it's a story of the life of Julius Caesar. Oh my word, we have a story, we have another source to the life of Julius Caesar, and we're reading the story, very excited now. We submit it to to the historians and the archaeologists. And there's a portion in there where it says that Julius Caesar looked on his watch and he saw there was time for the spectacular events to start in the Colosseum. Immediately, there should be some warning signs going up, just simply because watches weren't invented by the time of Julius Caesar. And so if we had to go and date the writing of this portion of this book, nobody in their right mind would date it before the time of the invention of watches, which, I guess it's around end of the medieval times. And so that's an anachronism to the writing. You find something in the text that doesn't belong to the time it's set in. And that's kind of what we find in Cain and Abel, and we find many examples of this. We'll feature some a little bit later, of the idea of first fruits being a spectacular and a offering to God, the most holy offering that belongs only to God. So the questions here is simply, how did they know to offer anything at this point, and how does the writer include the idea that first fruits is the sweet smelling? It's the the smoke goes up and Cain's smoke goes sideways. I remember the pictures from Sunday school. But it just gives us an idea that these are concepts that are developed way later by the time of Leviticus, really, I think, that are written back into the stories. And that's kind of what helps us to date these stories. These stories were not written down by Cain's younger sister who sat with a pen and paper. It's not how these things work. But they were written down quite a lot later. And as we saw with the Adam and Eve story, it seems like the Israelites used these stories to write their origin, but also to write in lessons, write in their own struggles, etc., etc. So we get Cain. Cain's in trouble from the beginning. He becomes jealous, he kills Abel, and then he gets banished from the presence of God. He moves further eastward. He's afraid for his life because there's apparently other people that would want to kill him. And so eventually he finds a wife, and I think he settles down in Nod and he starts building a city. So that's the story of Cain. And so there's this line of Cain that we find in the Bible that goes the one way, and then there's a new brother called Seth. Seth is the replacement for Abel that God gives to Adam and Eve. And then Seth's line, they both have the same. Let me just read from here so I don't get this wrong. So what happens to Cain is he starts building a city for his son Enoch. He has a son called Enoch, right? The story moves quickly to Enoch's great-grandson Lamech, who marries two women, and then he is the second murderer in the story. And so Cain's murder is perpetuated by his line. Lamech kills a man, it's the second murder in the Bible. He also hopes that he'll be protected like Cain from the aspirations of the people around him. He's portrayed in a very bad light. And this line of Cain starts moving further and further away from God. Then comes Seth, and coincidentally, God gives Seth to Adam and Eve as a replacement for Abel. Right, okay. But Seth does not build a city for his son Enoch. And this is where it's slightly strange, because Seth also has a son Enoch. But he doesn't build a city for his son Enoch. But the Bible says that from the time of Enoch, the son of Seth, people started calling on the name of Yahweh. Okay, so both these boys, Cain and Seth, the one is bad, the one is the replacement for the good. They both have the same son, name for their sons. The one goes off and it creates another murdering line, but the other creates a religious line, if we can say, a line in which people were starting to seek after God again. And so this story then that we find in Genesis, that includes the genealogy of the nation of Israel. That's the point, of course, as we said. It's like a roadmap, and it doesn't follow the route of Cain at all. It follows the route of Seth, and it's through the line of Seth that we eventually come to our main protagonist for today, and that's, of course, Noah. There's a one strange feature we just need to speak about quickly, and that is that in the book of Genesis, we find the ages of people. People are recorded to live very, very long. Like, for instance, we have Adam lives 930 years, Seth, 912 years, and so on. The question is simply like, how could people live that long, right? There was a 7th century bishop who actually went and calculated the age of the earth using these ages. So we added them all backwards into the chronology, and he ended up with a date for the creation of the earth, Sunday, October 23, 4004 BCE. But the truth is that careful study of these genealogies in the Bible, but also in the ancient world around them, shows us that they have a very important point to make. They're a very important feature of the book of Genesis. But it is not to create an historical timeline. It wasn't the idea of the writers. But there is another point to be made. So we also find long lifespans in the nations around the Israelites. And the flood seems to be the cutoff point, even in those narratives, of these very long lifespans. So what happens in the Bible, people lived these extraordinarily long lives until the flood, and then after that, they were reduced to about 100, 120. And it's just this cutoff point at which all of this happens. So interestingly enough, we also find similar ages in the Sumerian list of kings. So Sumer, one of the most ancient civilizations on the face of the earth, they have lists of kings that we have found through archaeology. And in there, we have the same type of notion. We have kings who rule for 1,000 years. There's one king who ruled for 40,000 years. But the moment that the flood happens, because as you'll find out later today, they also have flood stories. After the flood, that is reduced drastically, even in these ancient Sumerian lists, genealogy lists. So the point is that the flood makes a huge impact on the mortality of humans. You also see that in some of these other flood stories, there's the idea of immortality that's connected to the flood, and that after the flood, the mortality of humans are squashed down to this, more realistic number. So it's an important point to be made, but even from the other surrounding nations' lists of genealogy, it's quite obvious that it wasn't supposed to create for us a historical timeline. It's making another point. The point is that the flood had a huge impact on the human saga, um, but these numbers don't really tell us how long humans lived or how long they reigned as kings. Okay, so this brings us to Noah and the flood story. Noah comes from the line of Seth, this good son of of Adam. Um, and Noah seems to be the one that's going to reverse some of the real issues that's arisen on the earth during this time. Um, in many ways, he's depicted as a second Adam, and we'll be looking at some of these features that we find in the book of Genesis, so to speak. But these things are about to take a turn for the worse. Because what happens between the time of Noah and Adam and Noah is it seems like chaos pushes its way back into creation. And so that which God in Genesis 1 makes as very good and sits back and looks at and is satisfied on day 7, now seems to be in complete disarray again. And it seems like chaos is coming back, and it's coming back through the agency of, it seems like, humans they're losing the plot, and something needs to be done. Okay, so Noah and the Ark, or Noah and the Flood, is a very well-known Sunday school story, but I think we've been just really desensitized to what is really going on here. When you think of Noah and the Ark, I'm thinking of these little cartoon characters, a big little ark. Noah's walking with his stick and his long, beautiful robe, and a couple of animals 2 by 2 walking into the ark, and there's a beautiful rainbow. It's a beautiful picture, but the reality of the story of the flood is really the massacre. It's the killing of all life, not just humans, but also animals, except the small select group, right? So to help you desensitize, just think about the floods that might have happened in your area, tornadoes that come, natural events that kill people, babies, moms, grandparents. And we are completely taken aback when a family is murdered by, or not really murdered, but killed by natural disaster. And we say, how can this be? And, we question why these things, especially if it starts happening to us. It's a very hard thing to deal with, to have your family taken out by natural disaster. Now multiply that by a couple of 100,000, if not 1,000,000 times, and picture all of life. Let's stick with the humans for now. Babies, moms, drowning, all of them in this massive flood. And according to the stories, this is not a haphazard thing. It's not an act of nature, or it's not climate change or anything like that. It is because God wanted it so. It's really hard for anyone who takes the time to sit and think through what's going on there, to reconcile that with a modern sense of morality. But you don't even need a modern sense of reality. A modern sense of morality. You can also just think a little bit forward in your very Bible and go to John 3:16, where in John, God is portrayed as someone who loves the world so much that he would even sacrifice his own son. He would send his own son and let him be brutally killed instead of. That's the Christian, the general Christian dogma. So it's hard to bring together these two things, that and the questions arise, and you just need a little bit of time and an open mind to sit and think about, why couldn't God do this in another way? If he knew that this was going to happen, why didn't he just stop Cain? Why didn't he just accept Cain's offering? Put his own preferences aside for one moment, accepted Cain's offering, and the whole story might have been different. Or, as we'll find out in a moment, some part of this whole saga is these heavenly beings, they're called the sons of God in Genesis 6, that come down from the heavens, they start interbreeding with humans, and this accelerates this evil upon the earth. Why didn't he just,
Yeah.
kill those couple of beings or prevent them from coming down? It's very difficult to think about this in a logical sense and actually to make moral sense of it.
Yeah.
Most of us, for many parts of my life, I just gave up and just moved on. But the reality is that, there's so many questions to be asked here. Specifically, another question would be, the Bible tells us that God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he wouldn't let the Israelites go initially. Why couldn't he just soften the hearts of the people? I mean, if it just was for the sake of the babies, then it's really hard to work through that and think through that. And I'm hoping today that what we deal with in the flood and the contextual reality of what's going on here would actually help us realize that this is largely the view of an ancient people. And my personal opinion, and I'm going to throw this in, I normally don't want to do this too much but my personal opinion is that God didn't do that. It was a natural, if it was a natural disaster. What we do today, and let me just give one moment on this. A big hurricane hits your town and 80 people are dead. Christians and non-Christians, right? Some people get very excited when a Bible survives a hurricane or a flood, but the people died. It's illogical to think like that. But you will find some pastor the next day on a pulpit telling people that that area is known for its idolatry or has always been very immoral, or there's a lot of brothels there, or a lot of liquor shops, or you'll find some justification for why God had to do that. And that is kind of what's going on in Genesis. The Israelites, I'm running a little bit ahead of myself, but it's very hard to make moral sense of God destroying everything he has made. There could have been so many better ways to have, I can think of 10, to have dealt with this issue before it got completely out of hand, right? Okay, so what are we dealing with here? All right, that's why we're here, right? So at this point, it seems like creation has failed, and humans, the crowning point of God's creation, they've lost the plot completely. The questions, as we said, why would a loving God then just go and eradicate? Let's just like a genocide against the species, just completely eradicate all of them. We are often tempted, and this is what we do as Christians, we look at these accounts as scientific accounts, as historical accounts of a global flood that took place. Some people link this to the extinction of the dinosaurs because the dinosaurs would not have fit on the ark. I mean, it's amazing. But none of these questions or issues really were at stake or would have made sense to the ancient Israelites. And today we want to have a look at what would an ancient Israelite, what would he have thought of the story, and why did they take the time to write it down? And then again, we have to resist the urge to just make it a story about today and to say, oh, well, if God did it back then, it means that today all the natural disasters are ordered by God, and we might just not know the reason, and sometimes we just take the liberty to make up the reasons why God would do something like that. All right, so one of the main things about the story of Noah and the flood is the question is not so much how did it happen, but the question really is why. So we're going to be deep diving into that today. Why did the flood occur? So to help us take off our modern glasses, it might help to know, as we know now, that Israel's neighbors also had flood stories. They also had stories of a great flood that impacted their societies in a very special sense. One thing we do need to take note of is that these stories of the surrounding peoples are much older than the Jewish flood account. So that's important. So the argument that no, the Noah story is the original and everybody else copied that it does not stand in scholarly circles because it is just much later. Okay, so it seems like they also had stories. There are stories that come from Sumerian Assyrian, and therefore the Babylonian eras, that also mention this massive flood. And they have their heroes. Normally, these flood stories are named after the heroes that survived the floods, or the hero in the story. So we want to have a quick look at these stories and see if there's anything we can learn from the Israelite story from them. Okay, so the fact that there are other stories from around the Near Eastern area, the Near Eastern Middle East, right, that area around there into Iraq and so on, tells us that there might have been an event where there was catastrophic flooding. That would not be something strange to the earth, catastrophic type of flood event in the Near Eastern area.
Yeah.
Global flood, as far as we know scientifically, there's no evidence for a global flood. But I think archaeologists say that there might have been a huge flood event in the Near Eastern area around 2900 BCE. So that's about 400 years before the date in the Bible. If you had to take, the ages in the Bible as fact and chronology, they miss each other by about 400 years or so. But that's not too important for today. The point is just these stories originate because there might have been some, it probably was some historical kernel of truth about a massive flood that impacted that area. Okay, global flood, not so much. Those people believed the earth was flat, so when they saw themselves underwater, they assumed that everything was underwater. We know it doesn't work like that. Okay. The point here is that these stories of the surrounding peoples, they give different reasons for why the floods happened. Okay, so it's like today, a flood happens, people die, it's a big disaster. Everybody has an opinion of why the flood happened. Some say it happened because there's a lot of brothels there. Others say that, no, it's about this. It's highly subjective why a natural disaster occurs, especially if you're coming to it from a theological point of view, right? We can explain it by natural means, scientific means, but if you're coming to it from a theological point of view, you're going to get a different reason behind every tree, right? And that's kind of what happened. As humans today, we are concerned not always how things happen, but why things happen.
Yeah.
Why was there a tornado a couple of months ago that devastated one of the suburbs around the corner from us? Why do these things happen? Why does the God of creation then allow these type of things to happen? Is he the direct source of these things? I mean, does he make them happen? If it's a natural disaster, is he not in control of nature? There's a lot of questions. I can't answer them. I'm just throwing them out there today. They bring up a lot of why questions for us as humans. So two of the most relevant stories for Genesis are the ones that are written in an Akkadian language. Now, Akkadian, very special language. We've only recently deciphered much of the Akkadian. Sorry, you're going to lack the technical terms here, but the tablets, the clay tablets that we've discovered in Nineveh, as an example, they're very, very ancient. And this language is Semitic, and it's like the great-grandfather of the Hebrew language. So it's really much older than Hebrew. And there are two stories that are of relevance to us. These stories are named by the first names of their main characters. The first one is called Artaxerxes, and the second one is called Gilgamesh. Now, we're going to take 2 minutes on each of these just to give you a very brief overview. You can go read them, Google them up and go read them for yourself. These are two very old flood stories in the surrounding regions. Artaxerxes is the name of the first story, and Artaxerxes is like the Noah figure in the story. So in this account, there is a high god Enlil. He's like the god of the weather, and he wants to destroy all the humans. And the reason why he wants to destroy all the humans, they make too much noise, right? They make too much noise. And he's irritated by it. I think the story says he can't sleep. Right? They make too much noise, can't sleep. And so there's this character, Artaxerxes, and he solicits the help of the water god, Ea. And with Ea's help, he escapes the wrath of Enlil, and he builds this huge boat. And with this huge boat, he basically saves humanity when Enlil floods, tries to kill everyone because they're making too much noise. It's a, it's a fable, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So then Gilgamesh is another account. Gilgamesh, as far as we know, is an actual historical figure. He's the king of Uruk, one of the most ancient cities of civilization, I think in the Sumerian area. He lived around 2500 BCE, right? So that's around the time of, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's between Noah and Abraham, right? More or less around there. The story about him, though, is legend. It's not historical. And according to the story, he was 2/3 God, he was 1/3 man, and he had regular dealings with the gods. Like he was a god man type of thing. And so after the death of his friend Enkidu, he takes a journey, and his search is for immortality. So here's a little nod back to why these flood stories also alter the time frames or the lifespans of people. There's an element of immortality connected to this. So the quest leads him to Utnapishtim, and he's the Noah character. I'm not going to say that word again. Call him you from now on. He's the Noah character for this Gilgamesh story. But listen to this. So this figure, you, is immortal, once again, and he explains that he got it by surviving a great flood. Okay. He also survived the great flood by the grace of Ea, the same God that we find in the other account. This God told him to build a big boat. He got very specific specifications, dimensions for this boat, and he built this boat. And he had to load as many animals on the boat as he could. And so he and these animals survived. And this is the story of how he survived. So there are some similarities between the Genesis flood story of Noah and the Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis story. Similarities, once again, they are not the same stories. They're not necessarily copies of each other, but it tells us that these stories were part of human consciousness at that time, that they are so similar in some of the ways. Okay, so here are some of the ways in which these stories are very similar. Okay, they involve the building of a large boat according to precise instructions. And this is to escape a flood that a god is bringing, right? Okay. They had to bring the animals on board as well as their family to save them from this flood. Okay, so they had to waterproof the door of the boat with pitch and tar. This is almost explicitly mentioned like this in the Genesis account. The boat comes to rest on a mountain, right? Same as in the Genesis account. And birds are sent out early to go find out if the water had been subsided. So these are all things that you'll recognize from the Genesis account. So the point is not that the Israelites copied another story, got it and wrote it down. And the point is that these stories were part of human consciousness at this ancient time, and that it had to be explained what happened. Okay, so these stories are floating around orally during these times, and people adapted it. Elites, writers, theological writers, story writers, poem writers, they adapted them as they saw fit. So some sort of borrowing is obviously not a far-fetched idea in this case, but once again, the Genesis account indicates to us the presence of some Babylonian information that it was aware of, and that it then shapes its own version. So we saw this in the Genesis 1 account. A Babylonian awareness of Babylonian stories, myths, and the adaptation of those stories from a theological point of view. So we see the same type of thing happening here once again. The ancient people, including the Israelites, were using these stories as a platform to talk about how they understood the world and how they understood their God, right? And in this case, it seems like the Israelite writers used it, as we have seen before, to indicate how their God was different from the other gods. Because we're talking about the Babylonian context, possibly the Babylonian gods. All right. So let's talk about the Israelite flood story. The question is, how does the story portray Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, as different? As we've seen in the Atrahasis story, humans make too much noise, they get murdered for all of that. But the cause of the flood in Genesis is very, very different. The Israelite God does not wipe out all of life on earth because of noise. He's not that petty. He's not that reactionary. He's not that, I think petty is the best, probably the best word. He has much better reasons for doing this. Okay. So in Genesis 6, 1-4, we have the sons of God. These are like some heavenly type of beings that come down and they have sex with the earthly woman and they create these cross-human, human divine beings that are like giants. This thing for Israel is taboo. This is a taboo problem. They don't like this. They don't accept it. And this violates the order of the good creation that God had put in place, the heavens on top and the earth below. And this ultimately then starts to become, well, this then initiates the ultimate destruction of all humankind. Humans became so evil that ultimately, because of this, that ultimately God had to say, look, I'm pulling the plug on this thing. I'm going to press the reset button on creation. So the result is that wickedness of the humans get completely out of hand, and God regrets making them. So just a quick side note here, if you followed us through the previous series as well, this very early version of God seems to correlate with the Adam and Eve account, where God's very human-like, doesn't know everything, makes, walks, pulls, and etc., etc. Here, God regrets that he made humans. Like, this is not what you would expect of an all-knowing, all-powerful, eternal being. But this is the view that these stories portray of God. And to me, it's quite simple why they portray God in this way, because they come from stories that portrayed the pagan gods in this way, right? Okay, so I don't want to say too much about that. But it's very much different from the version of God, or the view of God that Christians hold today, right? It'd be very strange for Christians today to motivate any form of God regretted for doing that, or made a mistake, or has to go back on his plan to change it. It is obvious that the writers of these stories understood God in this very human way, that he could sleep, that noise could wake him up, and that he would regret doing certain things and would repent. Sometimes the word is used. Okay, put that aside. Earth is full of evil humans. God wants to press a reset button. Noah is the only one that's righteous and is allowed to escape the judgment. It's a terribly harsh verdict to kill everyone, as we said, in contrast to something like John 3:16. But we need to pause here and just to take our modern spectacles off completely and try and put some ancient glasses on. The Israelites are writing Genesis as the story of their origin, from the formation of the cosmos till they found themselves as a nation in Egypt. They had to then explain all the major things that happened according to everybody else, because anybody else read their story and said, but what about the flood? It's not in here. So they had to give an explanation for why all of humanity, or this massive event, happened that by now was just like an oral tradition. It had to be explained by the Genesis writers, because they were explaining this journey from cosmos to Israel in Egypt. They had to explain the flood in some way. And their story is not more historically accurate, but it does tell us of how they understood Yahweh, their God, in contrast to the other nations. So once again, Genesis 1 does almost exactly the same thing. Their God is not grumpy. He's not petty. He has standards. Ultimately, because he made humans to be in his image. They are not just their servants feeding the gods. That's not like in the other stories. They are the image of God, the representatives of God, and God has standards. And these oaks were way, way below the standard. So the direct reason for the flood then is given as, quote, every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts were evil continually. This is Israel's theological explanation for this ancient tragedy that took place. Humans got so bad, God had no choice. He had to get rid of all of them. God has to start over. When we get to Genesis 6 verse 9, we get to our second section heading. This is the account of that we mentioned very early on, right? And let me just get to where I am here. Most people know the story of Noah and the ark quite well, or so we think. I challenge you to go back and to go read that story again, because you probably know it from Sunday school and not from reading it yourself attentively. Okay, so what happens? Okay, Noah has to build this ark according to specific dimensions. He has to bring animals on board. They have to come 2 by 2, and they have to have 7 of each of the clean animals, right? Now, this should raise a flag, Tori. What is a clean animal? What is an unclean animal? This is an idea that develops much later in the priestly ideas of Israel. So once again, we have an anachronism in the writing that back then Noah would have known what was clean and unclean. That's something that comes with the law. So it's once again, it's written back, gives us an idea. The writers are writing much later than the time in which they are setting this account. Okay. So there's also the possibility, great possibility, most scholars accept this, that there is a doublet, in the Noah flood story. Now, you wouldn't pick this up if you went to Sunday school, because they won't tell you both versions, but you need to go read it for yourself to see that there's an intertwining. They're not placed chronologically next to each other, but they're intertwined. And for some reason, as we've said previously, the early adapters, the redactors, the ones who compiled the Torah in the 6th century, they don't care about the misalignments of the stories. They just want to preserve all the tradition. And Noah and the flood is a very, very good example of that. For instance, you can go check this up yourself. Genesis 7, 2-4. Noah has to take 7 pairs of all the clean beasts, once again, clean and unclean, and 2 pairs of all the unclean beasts. But he also has to take 7 pairs of the birds. For in 7 days it will rain for 40 days and nights. Right, okay, fine. Now we know this story. But Genesis 7 verse 8, which is just a couple of verses down, is a doublet. It gives the same instruction,
different detail.
But different detail. It says, of the clean and unclean beasts and the birds, 1 pair. Now, which is it? Yeah, you can't reconcile these 2 things. They don't work together. They're not supposed to work together. They are 2 traditions preserved and put together. It also goes on to say in verse 24, and the waters grew strong upon the earth for 150 days. So you really have an irreconcilable 2 stories that are weaved together, and it's okay. That's how they wrote, that's how they preserved the tradition for us. And it makes sense for us that because actually this story is not something that they invented. They adapted it as a theological statement in contrast to the statements of the peoples around them. Of course, the final thing I'd like to say about the story is that it carries echoes of creation. Right. So what happens in creation? God separates the water, so you've got water below, water above, and inside he makes space for life. What happens when the life becomes completely corrupt in Noah? It says, Genesis 7 says that the deep burst forth, waters from below come up, and the windows of heaven are opened. So what happens is it's in a literary sense, it's the reversal of order back into chaos. The water again floods everything. And so the waters collapse back in from both sides. They're returning the condition of the earth to something equivalent to the chaos that was there in the very beginning. God is returning earth to chaos. Why? Because of the chaotic behavior of the creations, and specifically the humans. So the flood is a morally disturbing story for most of us that have really thought it through, but they are making sense of an ancient tragedy in terms of ancient ways. In other words, then when God then stops the flood and the waters subside, the space is back, Noah becomes the second Adam in a sense. He gets the same promise: go, be fruitful, go multiply. It's almost copy and paste. So it's a later echo of the early formation of chaos from cosmos. It kind of happens again here. You can see the literary device. It's there. It's very, very clear. And God gives the same command to Noah that he also gave to Adam. Right. It basically reads as a second formation account. It's a reset through the same process that God initially used
Yeah.
to turn chaos into cosmos. Noah and his family, they are in a way a new creation, a new family, replacing Adam and what came from Adam. Like the nations of Noah, they themselves, and we'll do that a little bit later. Okay, so in conclusion today, Israelites in the Noah and the flood story, they are reframing and they are adapting ancient Assyrian, Sumerian, Babylonian stories to make theological statements about their God, how he is different from the other gods, while at the same time they're explaining the phenomena that everyone around them would have been familiar with and would have expected an explanation of. The God of Israel, Yahweh, he is in control and he is not petty. He has standards for humanity and he is not hesitant to act when humanity does not hold to these standards. And he is the one who will again turn chaos into order. And that's the story of Noah and the ark. Um, I don't want to go into the moral explanation of any of this or how you should be reading your Bible because of this, but I think anyone with a little bit of sense can take this information and go back and think about what we should be making of the story. One thing we should be careful of is attaching the death of all of humanity, slapping the name of God onto it, is something we don't want to happen today. Because if it's acceptable for God to kill a nation or humanity for that sense, because they're not holding up to the standard, it tends to translate into us today interpreting national disasters as God killing those people. And heaven help us that we ever get to a place where we would be actually the instruments of God going to kill those horrible, miserable, wicked people because that's what God would want. That's taking it too far. So we need to realize the Israelites were writing in ancient terms. And ultimately, I think it's usually just one question. Did God send a flood to kill all of humanity?
Or was there
You
a
make up
natural
your own
flood
mind.
and the story was
Make up
told?
your own mind
Yeah,
about
that's
that.
amazing.
I tend to prefer John 3:16. All right. Have a good day. Have a good Sunday. See you next time. Cheers.
Bye.